Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson, and I am here today to do part 2 of a short series that I have designed on the life of Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso was such a fascinating man, and he was really involved in so many different fields of art that I have chosen, as you're well aware, to focus on, if you saw last week's program, focus on his paintings. However, he has many other fields of endeavor and accomplishment as well. And as I mentioned last week, when he died, he was probably the most well-known and the wealthiest artist in the history of the world. Today I want to cover the second part of his life with you. I want to discuss some of the women that marked high points in his career. And at the very beginning of this program today, I would like to start by doing a very short one-slide review of some of the high points of last week's program. So let's get started with that. Here are some of the artworks you've seen before, and they reflect the lives of some of the women that shared his life. The Gourmet, remember when he was involved with his friend Casagamos, and Casagamos committed suicide in a cafe? And Picasso did an entire series of paintings called the Blue Period, where his work was all predominantly blue. He went from the Blue Period to the Rose Period and then into a period called the Circus Period, because the circus was at the bottom of the hill in Vermont, and he would go there and watch the performances, but then he would slip backstage into the tents to talk with the people. And he found out how disassociated they felt they were from the rest of the world, even though they were considered by the rest of the world to be important because they were entertainers. But once their show was over and the curtain came down, they were no longer important to the people in the audience. And he's trying to show some of that in his work. This is one that he called The Young Ladies of Avignon, and it's 5 women, and it is a cubistic piece of work that he develops that technique with another artist named George Braque. And George Braque and he will collaborate for several years. George will not move beyond the Cubist period, but Picasso and he will peacefully end their close association, and he will go on to do other things, such as go to Italy and design stage sets for ballets, and that's where he met his first wife, Olga. And they will have a son named Pablo. And notice that Pablo is wearing a harlequin costume, and this figure is also wearing a harlequin costume. The harlequin costume represented Picasso, and this was his son. This marriage won't go well. They will never be divorced because of the issues with finances, and she wanted half of everything he had, and he considered that to be a mountain of a request, but she will live till 1955, and so any of the women that he meets in between 1929 when he left her and 1955 when she died, none of them, of course, can be women that he can marry. One of his sweethearts, all of his life, was Marie Therese Walter. And this is the daughter that they have, Maya. So here you have, in the first half, I introduced you to the mothers of his first 2 children. He will have 2 more this week. He could do a lot of different subjects, and sometimes just as a break he would do something like this. It almost looks Cézanne-like, doesn't it? With the angle on the table, the tiltedness, and it has tendency toward cubism, but not. And then this wonderful line drawing that he does with the splashes of color to represent the flowers. And Picasso, as I told you last week, Picasso did not like to tell stories with his work. He felt that the story was yours to make up or to accept or understand on your own. So he said this, everyone wants to understand art. Why don't they try to understand the song of a bird? Why do they love the night, the flowers, everything around us without trying to understand them? Why does everybody have to understand art? I think that's a centuries-old question which probably goes without answer forever. This is an early piece that he did, and as many other artists would do, he would repeat his theme or his subject over and over. And he did these two pieces, both called The Three Musicians. Now, it is easy for you to see who is who here if I help you out with a few arrows. There's a harlequin, there's a clarinetist, and there's a monk who is also a singer in both of these paintings. They are oil paintings, but they do have some collage work added to them. There's a harlequin figure. Well, we know who that is, and he's playing a guitar. There's a clarinetist, and he clearly is playing his clarinet. And over here we have a monk, and he has a sheet music on his lap, and he would be the one who is singing. You see how wide open his mouth is? And under the table, just so you don't miss him, is a dog. The dog does not make this painting, but the harlequin does. But this time he's playing a violin. And the clarinetist is still playing his clarinet. But the monk has now switched. He's laid the music on the table, and he is now playing a keyboard. And you can see it right there. Sometimes his work is structured in such a way that it represents confusion to people who haven't seen it before, and then instead of trying to figure it out, they just pass it off as modern art and they don't understand it. Well, you see here, it's not difficult to understand what all these things are if you just look a little more closely. Look at the size of this piece. This is in the Museum of Modern Art. That is a very respectable, commanding painting. As time goes on, he replaces his harlequin figure, not completely, but he replaces it with a minotaur. And so then this figure becomes him in this painting. And let me show you what's going on. There are hands reaching out from a dark cave. Those are the hands of his wife, Olga, who is trying to still keep control of him. She will until the very end of her life, as much as possible. She will try to stalk him or the girlfriends that he has. So she's always reaching out to get a hold of him, but she's in a dark part of his life because, remember, socially they were very different, and all she wanted to do was be Mrs. Pablo Picasso, and all he wanted to do was to be Pablo Picasso, and the two really did not work too well together. And who's this precious over here? That's Marie Therese again. She has a veil over her face this time, and he is pushing back on this wall, but you can see him with a minotaur and carrying a dead horse, dragging it in his arms as he pushes back the wall, trying to get away from some of the things that he is finding to be distressing or distracting to him in his career. Along will come, after Maria Therese, will come Dora Maar. Dora Maar was a very, very accomplished photographer. She was from Yugoslavia, and she had come to Paris. And you notice the dates here? This is during the Second World War. So they are in Paris a lot of this time. So life for them was not all that easy. This is one of the paintings that he does of her. There's another one, and there's another one. And somebody said to her, "My goodness, Dora, don't you get upset when you see what he's done?" And she said, "They're all Picassos. They're not me." When Rembrandt painted his wife Saskia, was that Saskia, or was that Rembrandt's interpretation of Saskia? When Cézanne painted Hortense, his wife, was that Hortense? No, that was Cézanne's interpretation. These are Picasso paintings. But you, I think, are well aware of the fact that how he represents these women has a great deal to do with how he was thinking about them at the time. Dora Maar and he will have a very stormy relationship. I'll get into that very shortly. But she will eventually leave him. He will leave her. And she dies very poor and very much alone, but not until she reaches the age of 90 in 1997. But she has mental issues as well as a high level of self-absorption and moodiness. There is a photograph of her, some more of his paintings. You'll notice the long red fingernails. She was famous for those. That's how he met her. He was in a cafe, and he looked over, and this woman was sitting there with these long red fingernails, and she had spayed out her one hand on the table and had taken a small knife and was sticking the knife, throwing the knife onto the table so that it would stick into the wood, and tried to stick it into the spaces between her fingers. And yes, did she miss on occasion? Yes, so there was some blood there, nothing serious. But she did skin herself a little bit or stick herself with that. So he should have probably known ahead of time that she might be a rather unusual person, but she very much attracted herself to him, and she by this time knew who Pablo Picasso was, so certainly did not mind having his attention. This is a photograph that she did of him, which I think is lovely. It's a negative positive piece, but it really is, I mean, she absolutely had an incredible amount of talent. When they separated, she was living in, she moved into a flat, and at one point, as I said, she had some hospitalization issues with mental cases experiences that she had. At one point, her neighbors found her sobbing and sitting on the steps outside her apartment with nothing on. And he did many paintings of her crying because he called her the volcano because she erupted on a regular basis. And yes, does Olga stalk her? Oh, of course she does. And Marie-Therese, she is now the mother of Maya. Maria-Therese, this is the one who was right before Dora. She hated this woman. She hated her. And Picasso kept living with her for a considerable length of time, but he did over 60 pieces of her sobbing, more of her in that condition than any of the other women that he is associated with. I need to talk to you for a minute about Picasso and Franco, because that was not a happy time for either one of them. Franco knew Picasso was a very famous, important Spanish artist, and Picasso knew that Franco was destroying his country, so Franco could not do anything to coax Picasso at any point in time after he took office. There was no way that he could convince Picasso to come back to Spain to live. He might make a visit on occasion, but he never lived there again after Franco took over Spain. This painting, I showed you this last week. I'm going to give you some background on it first, and then I'm going to take a larger image of this and show you exactly what's going on in this piece and why it's such a critical historical document. The World's Fair was in Paris in 1937, and the people approached Picasso to see if he would do a painting for them. And of course, he is willing to do that, but he accepts the responsibility, and then all of a sudden this happened. The Germans had developed a new plane, and it could fly low, and they could shoot with their anti-aircraft and their machine guns out of the planes if the planes flew low enough. And they asked permission from Franco. Remember, Franco was trying, Picasso, when he was living in France, was trying very hard to get French citizenship. So if the Germans and the Spanish didn't get along, he wouldn't be sent to the Gulag. Well, now Franco is in charge of Spain, and he is also trying to placate the Germans some. So what does he say? The Germans approach him and say they just need to try some carpet bombing over some place, and it would be across the French border in Spain. So they do that between 1:30 and 4:30 in the afternoon on April the 26th. They carpet bomb this small town of Guernica. People ran to the fields for protection, and the machine guns from the airplanes gunned them down. Over 1,000 women and children were killed in that terrible, senseless act. Picasso is furious. He does many, many sketches, but he does this mural. He paints this mural for the World's Fair in Paris in 1937. He painted that in 3 weeks. Picasso was pro-Republican, and he was definitely anti-fascist. So once this painting had been shown at the World's Fair, where was it going to go? Well, Franco thought it would come back to Spain. Oh, no. Picasso was well enough known by that time that the Museum of Modern Art in New York City said they would take it. And so he loaned it to them. He did not sell it to them. They did not buy it. But they kept that painting with them in their collection, and I've been there and seen it several times before 1981, because in 1981 it was finally officially returned to the country of Spain. Picasso dies in 1973, and Franco dies 2 years later. So Franco never had that painting in his possession. This painting is huge, 20 feet, it's almost 27 feet long, and it's 11 feet high. And it is all in black and white with some tinted shades of white scattered through it. And again, just an encapsulation, it was a Basque town called Guernica. And Picasso in this painting is showing the senseless destruction of life. Here's what's going on. There's a woman holding a child who's dead. There is a soldier who's been decapitated, and his one hand over here has the stigma on it, the sign of the cross, the nail. The other hand is holding a broken sword. Here is a woman who is bent over, and she's just running, nowhere to go, but she's running, trying to get away. And over here is a woman who is screaming and yelling because coming down out of this building, which is on fire, she is also on fire. And the fire is coming down, it's consuming her, and she's falling into it. We have a man here. This man is holding a candle, or a candelabra, and he's holding this representing trying to find some light, trying to make some sense out of this terrible, terrible scene. And there is a horse. The horse has been stabbed, and it's in the process of death. And to the far side there is a bull, and that represents Spain. And it's just standing there, hoping against hope that things will work out. But guess what? The bull's tail is on fire. Now I take away a couple of these arrows and point out who's here. We have Marie-Therese, and Maya. Maya is the dead baby that she's holding. And you keep in mind that none of this was reality. This was all Picasso's statement about this town. And then this figure running and going nowhere is Dora. And who is falling out of the building on fire but Olga? When Picasso was working on this piece, Marie-Therese would come and visit him, and of course Dora was around. And at one point, they were both in the room with the studio with this painting and Picasso at the same time, and they said to him, "You have to pick. You have to pick which one of us you want." And he looked at them and he said, "I'm busy. You fight it out between yourselves." Well, the two of them do that. And they have a knockdown, drag-out catfight, pulling hair and punching and slapping and carrying on. And finally, Marie-Therese leaves, and Dora is left, but neither one of them is all the better for having gone through the fight. But that occurred, and he said later, he found that to be rather interesting, that these two women that cared about him so much would create such a scene in front of his work. One of the things that Dora does that is really important to art historians is, as Picasso worked on this piece, and this is his sketch of it, she documented everything he did every day. I'm going to put the painting back up again because it's important that we spend some time on this piece because it is such an important piece in history and in the life of Picasso. But if you notice this piece, you'll notice he does some shifting. In this one, the sketch, he's showing the soldier with his head down, and here the head is up. You'll also notice that this horse is now in this area, and the bull has been moved slightly and it's over here. So you have two animals, not just one. And if I wanted to and felt that I had the time, I could go through all the other areas too where he has made changes. But this is really quite an amazing sketch that he does in preparation for the work. You can see some of the areas that he kept. There's the building with the window, and then he added the fire up above it. He changed this arm. He's reaching up more with that. But the man is still holding the candle, looking for light. Dora Maar not only had trouble with Marie-Therese on occasion, but she also had trouble with Picasso. And she had done this photograph of him and evidently got disgusted with him about something and then painted all around it with black paint, but left his face show. And that was not for her. That was for him to see. She was a volcano. Now, along comes, after Dora, comes Francois. Francois will be 41 years younger than Picasso. She's an aspiring artist. He finds her to be elegant, extremely attractive, and they will spend from 1946 to 1953 together. He does many pictures of her, but most of his pictures and his paintings, his sketches, etc., are like with Marie-Therese Walter. They are more often than not very flattering pieces. They will have two children. Claude is born in 1947 and Paloma is born in Claude is born in 1947 and Paloma is born in 1949. I will give you a little closer look at them in the next two slides, but here you can see the happy times that they have together. But while all of this, and this is Francois with the children, Claude and Paloma. But this doesn't last because Picasso doesn't die until 1973. In 1970, Francois marries Jonas Salk, and they lived together for 25 years. He dies in 1995. But after she left, and she is the only woman in all of Picasso's venue of women who leaves him. And she left him, and she found a German who was a professional, was interested in her art and in her children and promoting her career, and she stays married to him for some time. Actually, she stays married to him until right around 1955, and I'll explain that in a minute. Now here's the grown-up Claude Picasso, and there's a small sketch that his father has done of him. He's working with him on a drawing there. Claude did become a very successful filmmaker. And as I mentioned, Francois was the only woman to leave him because she said he is a monster of indifference. He was still having small liaisons with other women even though he was living with her. And she would not have it, and so she walked out on him. And he will get his revenge, but you'll see why shortly. There is their daughter, Paloma. Paloma is the word for peace. And we have her mother, Francois Salk. We have a picture of Francois with Jonas Salk. And there is Paloma. And there is her brother, Claude. There is Picasso with little Paloma, cutie that she is. Paloma, of course, has gone on not in filmmaking, but in jewelry and in perfume. You've probably seen some of her things marketed in nice stores. Here's a picture of Francois and Claude and Paloma. And here's another picture of Paloma. And none of these, based upon what you have seen before of the interpretations that Picasso has done of people that are sharing his life, none of these are distressful. When Olga died in 1955, Picasso got in touch with Francois, because from his point of view, the relationship really wasn't quite over yet. Well, by this time, Francois had already married somebody else, but Picasso led her to believe that if she would get a divorce, that he would marry her. Well, you saw in the last slide that she ended up in 1970 marrying Jonas Salk. What happened? She got the divorce. And then Picasso got his revenge. He went off and he married somebody else. And then he felt that everything was okay. I have shown you this picture before when I talked about the Spanish artist Francisco Goya and the painting that he did called The Executions of the 3rd of May, and how these French soldiers just lined up innocent people, bakers, carpenters, teachers, priests, and just murdered them senselessly. During the life of Picasso, there is a major massacre in Korea in 1951, and that conflict, again, just devastated Picasso, because again, it was a situation where people were just senselessly murdered. Now take a look at what he has done to make his statement about this. The men who are lined up are holding candlesticks. They are shooting at these innocents with candlesticks, except for this guy who has a sword. And he's facing towards us, but away from us and back at them. But it's all senseless. It makes no sense at all. And over on the other side, you have a pregnant woman whose child is clutching at her. And beside her is an older woman who is cradling a small child. And then another woman who's just resigned herself to whatever's going to happen. A teenager beside them, just trying to cover up herself as much as she can. This little guy trying to run away, and down here, this small child, unassuming, not knowing, just playing, innocently playing, and they will all be killed. In the background, there's a tank coming up over the hill. So to make no mistake that this was a massacre that had occurred. And also in the background, there's a river that separates them. The attackers from the innocent, and back here are burned out homes and buildings. So a piece makes quite a statement. I don't talk a lot about structure in Picasso's paintings, but it was certainly there. And if you look at this piece, all of these figures fit beautifully into a square, while on the other side they fit into a triangular shape. Both shapes are very stable. This one, the triangle of all four of the primary shapes, is the most stable and the most difficult to shift or tip. But there it is, The Massacre in Korea by Picasso. His representation of the conflict in 1951. The woman who comes in and marries Picasso is a woman named Jacqueline. She will meet him in 1953. They will marry in 1961. She is 50 years younger than Picasso. She's 29 years old when she marries him, and she had been divorced. He met her at a pottery factory, and she had been divorced, and she had a daughter, and her daughter said, "What are you doing marrying this man? He's 50 years older than you are." And she said, "Oh, he needs somebody to take care of him. He needs somebody around him. So I think I should do that." Well, of course, yes. There are probably more answers to the question than that. But they have a good time together. And by his continuing to seek out younger women all the time, he really felt that he was adding years to his life. And here you can see Jacqueline and Picasso working on some kind of a damp step in his studio. And if you look, here's another picture of the two of them. And if you look at these different pictures, his interpretation of her is relatively calm. Nobody's crying, nobody's gnashing their teeth, nobody with long red fingernails or anything like that. But I want you to notice this. Look at the clutter. He could not work in a clean space. He had to have clutter. Everything had to be stacked up around him, and things had to be abandoned and then picked up again at a later time. And if you were lucky, there were some chairs that were available for you to go and sit in if you were invited into his studio, because not everybody was. And the other thing that Jacqueline does is Jacqueline will protect him towards the end of his life. She doesn't make him he does not become a recluse, but he's older, he's going to die at 91, but she does everything she can to protect him against people, against reporters, against even his own children. This is one of his famous pieces of her. He loved her long neck. And you see that. He will do more interpretations of her than of any other women that he has lived with or been married to. And in 1 year, he did 70 of her. Now, this is a piece that is done on clay. Jacqueline, as I mentioned, worked for the Madura pottery factory, and that's how he met her, because he decided that it might be a nice thing to get into creating in clay and creating his drawings and designs on clay shapes. So here's one that he does of her. She will live, after he dies, she will live for 13 more years. But after he dies, she will go every day, and I think I say it in the next slide. She will go every day to his grave. And on the 8th of every month, she will go to his grave. And on the 8th of April, which was the day that he died, 13 years after he had passed, she shot herself. Now, let's take a look at this for a minute, because this was a painting that you saw when I discussed Velázquez. And this was done in 1556, and this is Philip. You can see him back here with Mariana. And Picasso saw this painting when he was a small boy. And he had sketches that he had kept from being at the Prado and having seen this painting. So this was always in the back of his mind. And look, 301 years later, he starts reinterpreting that painting. And he will do 58. I picked out one of his earliest ones for you to see. And again, because it helps to know where things are, so you don't have to wander around so much and waste your time with that, let me show you. There is the man who was the advisor to the Queen, to Queen Mariana, and he is standing in the doorway. Here he is back there. There is Margarita, the little princess. There is the nun and the advisor to the king, and they're here, and they're here. Because the king liked dogs so much, and so did Diego Velázquez. There's the dog. There's the dog again. There's the little dwarf who is nudging the dog with its foot. There is one of the maidens in waiting offering Margarita something on a silver tray. There is the huge canvas, and you'll notice here the scale of Diego in this piece and the scale that Picasso has given him here and here. But in both cases, they're holding their palette with the long-handled brushes. So he does a number of these. Many of them are in color, but it becomes his reinterpretation of what he considered to be one of Spain's famous artists, most important artists. As time goes on and has gone on, it's become Picasso everything. Macintosh in 2004 did this. They called that Picasso. There was a fish that was created, and they didn't know what to call it. It was the triggerfish, and so they said all these wonderful colors swimming around in the water, and it was so fascinating, and it zipped in and out, and it never stayed in one place very long, and they said, oh, this is a Picasso painting. We'll call this Picasso. There was a 46-year-old man who was very much enthralled with the work of Picasso and decided that he would take his car and redesign it so that it was roadworthy, but it looks like a traveling Picasso painting. Picasso had not been disloyal to the Soviets or to Russia during the Second World War. So when he died in 1937, they dedicated a stamp to him. People who make contact lenses are always looking for interesting ways to name them, and so this one is called Picasso Blue. And there, of course, is the dove, which has survived since the late 1940s, 1949, when he did the original. And it's still a very, very popular, easily identifiable piece of peace for the entire world. Okay, a quick review of his women. Fernande, remember her, the purring cat? The one that Gertrude Stein said she was happy to meet her, but once she said hello, there wasn't anything else to it. That's Fernande. And Fernande was actually a friend of Eva's. So when they split up, Picasso moved over to Eva, not realizing that in 2 years, in 1913, Eva would become very ill, and in 1915 would die of tuberculosis. And she was his intellectual poodle, is what he called her. You may be wondering, we know why he quickly married Jacqueline, and that was to take revenge on Francois. But what was the interest here that kept him circling around her till he married her in 1918? She wanted to have nothing to do with him. He was a painter. He was an artist. He did all this messy stuff. She was a ballerina. She had come from an aristocratic Ukrainian family. Her father was an army officer. And so she really kind of sloughed him off. And it was her resistance that attracted him to her to the point where he said he had to have her, so he married her. And remember, his mother was the one who said, I don't think this is going to work. He even painted a picture of her with a mantilla on her head that I showed you last time. She said, I just don't think she's going to be right for you. And of course she wasn't. She wanted money. She wanted social position. She wanted the attention of being Mrs. Pablo Picasso, but she didn't really want to have a lot to do with him except what was in his wallet. Probably the one of all of the women that shared Picasso's life for any length of time, and she did for 9 years. Probably Marie-Thérèse is the one who loved him the most. She never gave him, except for the fight in front of the painting Guernica, she never gave him trouble. She was soft, she was kind, she was good, she was pleasant. Any times with her were enjoyable. This piece is so typical of that. It's just a soft, sweet piece of work. But keep in mind that she only lived to 1977, and that's because he died in 73, and by 77, her whole life she had spent thinking that at some point he would come back and he would marry her because she was so good to him. And she realizes that's not going to happen, and then he dies, and it definitely is not going to happen. So they missed her 4 years later and found her hanging. She had hanged herself in an abandoned garage someplace in Paris. She really could not go on without him. The three that have been the focus today are Dora Maar. And there she is with the long fingernails. The volcano, the one who erupted without any cause or reason, depending on what she felt like. And Francois, the one who left him, and then he took out his revenge by marrying this one, Jacqueline. And Jacqueline will not be kind at the end of his life. When he dies on April 8th in 1973, Jacqueline will not allow his children near the property. It's a gated community, and she will have nothing to do with any of them because Picasso left thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of work. And she did not want them coming in and taking things. One of the two sons of Pablo, Picasso's first child to Olga, one of the two sons came to the gate, and when he was not allowed in, he stepped to the side and he drank a bottle of bleach and died right there. Now, the other two children from Pablo's marriage live on, and they do inherit some things. But the two children, Claude and Paloma, the children of Francois, they will also inherit things. So there are two children here, two survivors here, two here, and then his wife, of course. So the estate ends up being divided after quite a bit of turmoil, divided into 5 parts. Historians have often wondered what would have happened if Picasso hadn't had this myriad of different types of women around him. His work ends up being pretty much a testimony to them and him. And so that's why in this lecture I have focused so much on them and his interpretations of how they looked to him, because they are really the drivers behind some of his greatest works. They weren't simply his lovers or his muses, his models, but this one especially was extremely jealous of him and wanted to keep him to herself as much as possible. But it's their partnerships with him that deserve some of the recognition for the popularity of the work that he presented to the world. There were 3 photographs of him. I love this one. If you notice, those aren't his fingers, those are baguettes. He has his hands down, but he's positioned his arms so it looks like his fingers are coming up on the table. I just think that's kind of a fun piece. There he is, intent on a piece that he's working on, and there he is just in a reflective mood. There he is, happy as a clam in a studio that you would need a roadmap to get through and then to get back out of. Bought these huge homes. He had a number of homes, and in some cases when the estate was settled, a part of the estate was divided so that some, like his granddaughter to Pablo, his granddaughter inherited one of the estates. I mentioned her last week because she is the one who does run an orphanage in Vietnam. And recently, one of the major auction houses in the United States sold quite a number of pieces of work that she had inherited. She inherited 10,000 different works of Picasso. Now that's not all paintings, that's sculpture, that's sketches, it's all different kinds of things. But she sold those to raise money to support the orphanage that she sponsors in Vietnam. She actually has 2 of her own children, and she adopted 3 Vietnamese children. Here's some more another picture of him. And somebody said to him one time, you know, as you're getting older, you really need to write a journal about all this. He said, no, my paintings are the pages of my journal. And I have to think that you would agree with me that that is probably, in fact, the case. On April the 7th, in 1973, Jacqueline and Picasso hosted a dinner party at his estate. And at the dinner party, the wine was poured, and it was time for a toast. And Picasso stood up and said this, "Drink to me, drink to my health. You know I cannot drink anymore." And he sat down. He will die the next morning. It's almost as though he knew. And as I mentioned before, Jacqueline, after his death, Jacqueline will visit his grave every month on the 8th, the day of his death. And it's on the 13th year, on April the 13th, or on April the 8th, the 13th year after he has passed, that she can take it no more. He really had become what she did with her life. And so she took a gun to the gravesite and she committed suicide right there. Even though the country of France balked at giving him his citizenship, they really were very happy to have their hand out when he died there, and his estate had taxes that needed to be resolved. And so one thing led to another, and in order to pay the estate taxes, the family had everything appraised, and work, before anything was divided, works to cover the costs for the estate taxes were selected, and they're in this huge museum, which is in Paris. And I think it's interesting. It was a mansion that was built in 1650, but it was built by a man who had collected salt taxes. And this house now collected estate taxes from the estate of Picasso. There is also another very important museum that houses a great deal of his work, and it's actually 5 palaces that are kind of connected together in Barcelona. And these palaces just kind of bump into each other, and you can just go through and visit the different parts. This doesn't open up until 1963. And Picasso in 1970 was very much in favor of this, because this is now, this is now the town, of course, that represented him, other towns too, but spent a lot of his time there. He donated 920 pieces, and before she died in 1981, Jacqueline donated 41 more. In January, I'm going to be starting, in fact, actually starting towards the end of December, I'm going to start a short series on sculpture. And in January, I will revisit Picasso with you, because Picasso's sculpture also just screams so much about his life. And for example, this little head on this baboon. The ears are actually teacup handles, but the baboon's face is made from 2 cars, 2 toy cars that his son Claude had been given and then had outgrown, and they were just cast into a corner. So he took one, turned it upside down, and made the jaw on the baboon, and then the top part he turned into the top of the head and the nose, and then stuck shapes in here for the eyes. We'll go over that in more detail at that point. But where he met Jacqueline was at the pottery factory, and he ended up doing a number of pieces for that pottery factory. And the pieces are interesting because the shapes of the images are emphasized by the shape of the container. And he will actually end up painting, and I'll review this again with you in January, but he will end up painting one, and then he has 3 assistants who are highly qualified and have been personally selected by him, who can then paint other pieces of pottery in this shape with this exact image on it. And when on the bottom, if you turn them over, they are signed slightly different than just his name. They do not sign just, it's by Picasso, but then who the artist is, the painter who has added the work to it. Picasso would like me probably to say to you this: there is no abstract art. You always have to start with something. You always do. And afterwards, you begin removing all traces of reality. And that is, in fact, sort of what he did. And I guess I can say to you quite honestly that his works do show the influence of his personal traumas, the tragedies in his life, going back to the death of Kazagamo, and also the death of his little intellectual poodle, Eva, but also the great joys that were in his life, because there also were many, many of those. So we look at Picasso as probably the 20th century's giant in the field of art. Giant. Not in a field, but the field. And if you remember, his middle name was actually supposed to be his last name. This was his father's name, but the Ruiz family was famous for leather gloves. So he dropped his family name and picked up his mother's maiden name, and that's why we call him Pablo Picasso. The mannequin and the mannequin and the monitor are both very, very typically excellent, really typical examples of who he was. He could be sarcastic and he could be charming. He could be a monster, as Francois said, and he could just be as sweet and loving as anybody you'd ever want to be around. He was a man who tended to wear a mask to get through the maze in his own life, but he will be responsible for nurturing countless art movements that occur in the 20th century, and he lives well into the 20th century. So his opportunity to provide that influence was ongoing for many, many years. What does he work from? Mostly his imagination. He didn't have a lot of people come in and sit for him. Remember when he had Gertrude Stein come in and she sat for 90 to 100 times, and then he said to her, look, I've got to wipe out your face. I can't see you for looking at you. I'll send you the painting when it's done. And he dismissed her. So many times he worked from his imagination, more likely than not, than the real thing. On the day that he died, the cocktail dinner party was over, people were dismissed. He went to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning because after they left, he went back to his studio and painted. And then the next morning, he calls, he can't get out of bed. And it's still April the 8th now, but it's probably around 8 o'clock in the morning. He called to Jacqueline and he said, I can't get up. And within 2 hours, he was gone. So this man, this giant, this artistic giant, has done much to influence and was also, as you saw before, well influenced by many artists that came before him. If you have any comments or any questions about this lecture series, please be in touch with the address on the screen. And next artist that I'm going to talk to you about is also Spanish. There are actually 2 more coming up, but the next one is the wild and crazy and highly talented surrealist artist named Salvador Dali. And if you don't understand surrealism, I think I can explain that to you quite easily when the time comes. But if you look at the 2 works on the screen, you can see they are very, very detailed, very exact, but also very different because Salvador Dali is an extremely talented artist, but also wildly crazy. Some of the stories about him are just almost hair-raising, but fun to hear. I will not be back next week because it's the week of Thanksgiving and I'm going to take a break, but I will be back on December the 1st, and I will be happy to present this artist to you at that time. Now, are there any questions about Picasso?
Yes, I have one question for you. To what extent was Guernica influenced by the brutal combat paintings of Goya?
I'm not really sure that the Guernica painting was influenced that much by the works of Goya. Not that he would not have known about them, but I really think that Guernica absolutely destroyed, emotionally destroyed Picasso when he saw what Franco had allowed to happen to his own people. So I think that probably the painting that he does that reflects the Korean War strongly was influenced by Goya, but I'm not sure about the Guernica one. I will say to you that you might find something, you might read something about that, but I have not found anything yet that says that the influence was Goya, that it really was just the broken heart of Picasso. Any other questions?
That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And if you have an interest in getting a copy of the handout on Dali ahead of time, it's available for you. And you just go to askpresenter@willowvalley.com and there it will be. Now, in the meantime, it'll be 2 weeks till I see you. And I do want to see you again. And I do hope that in the meantime you stay safe and you stay happy and that you are very thankful that we live in such a wonderful nation. Good to be with you. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.